My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a senior payroll specialist for a regional hospital network. Numbers have always made more sense to me than people. 3 weeks before everything unraveled, my 72-year-old downstairs neighbor, Walter Jenkins, spent every afternoon sanding and restoring an old oak porch bench because he said every real home deserved a place where people could sit together. At exactly 8:17 a.m. on Thursday, April 3, my phone vibrated with an email that doubled my rent from $9.50 to $1,900. I looked down at the small brass mailbox key hanging from my keyring. Months later, that same key would be lying alone on a polished bank conference table. What I didn't understand that morning was that the rent increase wasn't really about housing. It was the final payment on a debt I never agreed to carry, and the beginning of the first boundary my family could no longer cross. My parents, Richard and Denise Carter, owned the duplex where I'd lived for almost 6 years. They always called it a blessing, proof that family looked after one another. Looking back, I realized the blessing came with invisible conditions. Every Sunday dinner ended the same way. Before anyone reached for dessert, Dad placed Ethan's blue business folder in the center of the dining table. His custom furniture company became the conversation everyone else revolved around. Sales numbers, supplier invoices, equipment payments, everything circled back to Ethan. The folder became our family's ranking system. His future occupied the middle of the table. The rest of us learned to eat around it. Walter never knew any of that. He simply waved whenever I came home, shared tomatoes from the tiny garden behind the building, and insisted that Oldwood only became beautiful after surviving enough storms. I admired my parents for helping Ethan chase his dream, and I told myself that staying quiet made me supportive. The truth was simpler and uglier. Every time I ignored the unfairness, because it wasn't aimed at me, I helped make it normal. That's why I made sure there could be no misunderstanding. On March 11, I texted my mother asking whether my lease renewal would remain $9.50. She replied, "Yes, nothing's changing." On March 18, I emailed Dad asking for written confirmation before setting my annual budget. He answered, "You're all set." My Aunt Linda heard them repeated over Sunday dinner, and Ethan shrugged without looking up from his phone. Then Mom smiled, almost absent-mindedly, and said, "Family takes care of family." Everyone nodded. I did too, never noticing that Ethan's blue folder looked noticeably thicker than it had the week before. At 8:17 a.m., I opened the email expecting another routine lease renewal attachment. Instead, the first sentence read, "Effective May 1st, your monthly rent will increase from $950 to $1,900. I reread it 3 times, convinced a decimal point had been misplaced. Then I noticed Dad's signature at the bottom and a scanned copy of the revised lease. The porch bench Walter had spent weeks restoring sat beside my front door, still smelling faintly of fresh varnish. I'd bought 2 potted ferns the night before because I thought they would look good on either side of it. My moving budget was balanced, my emergency fund was healthy, and I finally felt like I had a stable place to call home. I called my father at 8:26 a.m. "There's got to be a mistake." "There isn't," he answered, his voice calm enough to make the words feel rehearsed. Mom picked up on the extension a moment later. "We need you to understand," she said. "Ethan's business has fallen behind on its loan payments. We're helping him through a rough patch." I stared at the porch bench while the email remained open on my laptop. What does that have to do with my rent? Dad cleared his throat before saying the sentence that would echo through the rest of the year. Family takes care of family. In other words, I was expected to finance my brother's second chance without ever being asked whether I wanted to. Walter came upstairs about 20 minutes later carrying a small cushion he'd sewn for the bench. He took one look at my face and quietly placed it beside me. "So," he asked gently, "did the paperwork come through?" I handed him my phone without speaking. He read the email once, nodded almost to himself, and looked at the bench instead of me. "I guess," he said softly, "the bench doesn't belong here after all." He didn't cry. He didn't complain about the hours he'd spent restoring it. He simply picked up the cushion and brushed an invisible speck of dust from the wood as though protecting it from disappointment. Somehow, that hurt more than if he'd shouted. While he stood there in silence, memories lined themselves up with painful clarity. Ethan borrowing $2,300 from me after college that somehow became a gift. Me covering mom's utility bill one winter because Ethan's cash flow was tight. Skipping my own vacation so Dad could help Ethan buy a new delivery van. Every small sacrifice had felt temporary at the time. Together, they had built this morning. I wasn't just the person being treated unfairly. I'd spent years helping convince everyone, including myself, that this arrangement was reasonable. By lunchtime, I was desperate for someone to tell me I wasn't imagining how wrong it felt. Aunt Linda sighed before I'd even finished explaining. "Oh, Olivia, don't make it a thing. Businesses struggle. Ethan needs support." My cousin Melissa was even quicker. "You have a good job. He doesn't. Just help him. It's only money. Only money. Only another $9.50 every month. Only the difference between saving for my own future and paying for someone else's past decisions." The last call I made wasn't to family. It was to Grace Moreno, the loan officer at the community bank where I'd kept my savings account since I was 22. We'd met several times because she'd helped me set up a first home savings plan. I explained everything, expecting polite sympathy. Instead, there was a long pause. Then Grace asked one quiet question. "Olivia, you know this isn't normal, right?" Nobody had ever given me permission to think that before. The next morning, I sent my parents one final offer. I wrote that I understood Ethan needed help. I offered to pay $200 a month for 6 months instead of $950. I even suggested putting the extra payments into a written agreement so that if Ethan's business recovered, the increase would end automatically. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an argument. It was my last attempt to keep the family intact without pretending fairness no longer mattered. Dad replied 38 minutes later. "No." Mom followed with a longer message. "If you refuse to support your brother, we'll have to reconsider whether living here is appropriate. Don't expect the family to understand your decision. And if Ethan loses the business because of this, you'll have to live with that." The message ended exactly the way I should have expected. Family takes care of family. For the first time in my life, the sentence didn't sound loving. It sounded like a bill. I read my mother's message 6 more times before I closed my phone. Then I opened a blank text. The first draft lasted 11 seconds. Asterisk, you've spent my entire life treating me like Ethan's emergency fund. Don't contact me again. Asterisk. I deleted it. The second draft was even harsher. Asterisk, when the business fails anyway, don't ask me to help clean up the mess. Asterisk. I stared at those words until they blurred. They were honest, but they weren't the kind of honesty I wanted to live with. Anger has a way of making permanent records out of temporary feelings. So I started over. I thanked them for giving me a place to live over the past 6 years. I explained that I couldn't afford the new rent and wouldn't sign the revised lease. I told them I'd be moved out before April 30, the apartment would be professionally cleaned, every utility would be transferred, and I'd leave both copies of the keys on the kitchen counter. I ended with one sentence. Asterisk, my door will always be open if we're ready to treat each other like family instead of obligations. Asterisk. No accusations. No scorekeeping. No mention of Ethan. No mention of the money. My mother's reply arrived at 3:42 p.m. Asterisk, do what you think is best. Asterisk. That was it. 22 years of trying to earn approval reduced to 7 words. For the first time, I stopped thinking about how to negotiate a better place inside my family. Instead, I started imagining a different life altogether. Grace helped me calculate what I could actually afford instead of what everyone else expected me to carry. By the following Tuesday, I'd signed a lease on a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't as large as the duplex, and it overlooked a parking lot instead of maple trees, but it belonged to me in the only way that mattered. Nobody could suddenly decide its purpose had changed because someone else had made bad financial decisions. As I packed boxes, Walter insisted on helping despite his aching knees. "I've moved more times than I can count," he said, folding newspaper around my dishes with practiced hands. "A smaller place that gives you peace is bigger than a mansion that charges you for it." Before we left, He carefully loaded the restored oak bench into the rented moving truck himself. "It was always yours," he said with a small smile. The brass mailbox key stayed clipped to my keyring through the entire move. Every time I heard it tap against my keys, it reminded me that a home wasn't measured by ownership papers or family history. It was measured by whether you felt safe unlocking the door. On the first Saturday after I moved in, I hosted a potluck dinner. The folding table I'd borrowed from a neighbor only seated 8 people, and 3 of the chairs didn't match. Grace brought homemade lasagna. Walter arrived carrying lemon pie balanced carefully in both hands. My coworker Jasmine brought paper plates because she'd guessed I'd forget them. Someone spilled iced tea before dinner. Someone else burned the garlic bread. Everyone laughed. Nobody ranked anyone. Before the meal started, I sent one final invitation to my parents. Dinner starts at 6 if you'd like to come. No expectations. We'd be happy to have you. I kept 2 empty chairs at the end of the table until nearly 7 o'clock. They never came. Later that evening, Aunt Linda called. "I had lunch with your parents," she said cautiously. "They're hosting everyone at the house tonight. Catered food. New table linens. They wanted things to feel normal." Normal. That word stayed with me. I imagined the polished dining room, the expensive serving dishes, and Ethan's familiar blue business folder resting proudly in the center of the table. I also imagined the empty seats left by people who had quietly chosen not to attend. The next Monday, Grace called me from the bank. Her voice carried the careful professionalism she always used before delivering important news. "I probably shouldn't say much," she began, "but I can tell you something that affects you indirectly." I waited. Ethan's refinancing application was denied. I sat down without realizing I had been standing. "The rent increase," I whispered. "Wouldn't have saved the business," Grace finished gently. The numbers had been trending the wrong way for a long time. Even another $9.50 every month wouldn't have changed the bank's decision. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. All those threats. All that guilt. All those promises that I alone could prevent disaster. None of it had ever been true. My parents hadn't asked me to rescue Ethan's business. They had asked me to postpone its inevitable ending. A week later, Walter and I carried the oak bench onto my apartment balcony. It fit perfectly beneath the evening sun. He stepped back, folded his arms, and admired it with quiet satisfaction. "There," he said. "Now it finally knows where it belongs." I wish I could tell you victory felt satisfying. It didn't. I hadn't lost an argument. I'd lost the illusion that my parents saw me the same way I saw them. Grace stopped by later with coffee and sat beside me on the bench. After a long silence, she said something I'd never considered. "Your parents probably believed they were protecting Ethan because they'd spent so many years convincing themselves his success would justify every sacrifice they made for him." She wasn't defending them. She was explaining them. There was a difference. Understanding their fear didn't erase what they'd done. It simply reminded me that broken people often mistake control for love. As the sun disappeared behind the neighboring buildings, I turned the brass mailbox key between my fingers. I'd spent years believing the safest place in the world was the home I'd grown up in. Now I knew something different. Sometimes the bravest thing you can unlock is the door that leads away from it. Almost a year passed before my parents appeared at my apartment without calling. It was 4:12 p.m. on a Saturday when I heard a knock. I looked through the peephole and saw my mother smoothing the wrinkles from her jacket while my father stood with his hands folded, looking older than I remembered. I didn't rush to answer. For years, every conversation had happened on their schedule. This one would happen on mine. I finished washing the coffee mug already in my sink, dried my hands, and let nearly 5 minutes pass before opening the door. Neither of them complained. That alone told me something had changed. Mom tried first. We've all said things we regret. It was an old strategy. Make the conflict sound mutual so nobody had to own it. I simply waited. Dad tried next. You know your mother hasn't been sleeping. Another familiar approach. If guilt couldn't win through obligation, perhaps it could arrive disguised as concern. It landed differently now. I'm sorry she's hurting, I said quietly. But that isn't the same conversation. Silence settled between us. Then my father asked a question I'd never imagined hearing. Do you think we'll ever feel like your parents again? There wasn't a perfect answer. I could have told him I miss them every holiday. I could have told him I still reached for my phone whenever something good happened at work. Instead, I told him the truth. I don't need an apology for charging me $900. I need you to repair what was broken before the money ever entered the conversation. They looked confused. I nodded toward the balcony. Walter was outside, watering the tomatoes he'd insisted on growing in oversized planters after moving into the same apartment complex a few months earlier. The first person you need to talk to isn't me. My mother frowned. Walter. Yes. He didn't lose anything. He watched someone spend weeks building a gift for what he believed was my home. Then he watched my own family turn that home into collateral. Neither of them argued. I have one condition, I continued. If we're going to rebuild anything, it starts with treating the people who stood beside me with the respect you should have shown from the beginning. Walter looked surprised when I asked whether he'd be willing to speak with them privately. He nodded. The three of them stepped onto the balcony while I stayed inside. I never listened through the door. Some conversations deserve witnesses. Others deserve privacy. I only know it lasted almost 40 minutes. When they came back inside, my mother's eyes were red. Walter's expression was gentle but tired. My father looked like a man who had finally stopped defending himself long enough to hear someone else. None of them repeated what had been said. They didn't need to. Sometimes the most important conversation in a family is the one nobody else gets to hear. By the following spring, Sunday looked completely different. Nobody met in my parents' dining room anymore. Instead, once a month, everyone gathered in the shared courtyard outside my apartment building. Someone grilled hamburgers. Someone else brought potato salad. Children chased each other between picnic tables while adults argued about movies instead of money. There was no blue business folder. There was no seat reserved for the favorite child. There wasn't even a head of the table. There was only a circle. My parents came every month. Not first. Not last. Simply as two more people carrying food. The smallest change meant the most to me. One afternoon, my mother arrived carrying a tray of homemade rolls. Before sitting down, she walked over without saying a word and placed my brass mailbox key, freshly polished after she'd quietly offered to have it cleaned, into my palm. She didn't make a speech. She didn't ask whether everything was forgiven. She simply smiled, almost shyly, and took the nearest empty chair instead of waiting for someone to choose one for her. Ethan's furniture company closed before the end of that summer. For a while, I worried he would disappear under the weight of the embarrassment. Instead, he accepted a management position at another woodworking company. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Without the pressure of proving he was the family's great success, he became easier to know. One evening, he admitted he'd never asked our parents to raise my rent. They'd decided that on their own. It didn't erase his mistakes. But it reminded me that families are rarely damaged by only one person's choices. Walter finished another oak bench that autumn. This one wasn't for me. It was for his granddaughter, who had just bought her first home. As he loaded it into the back of a pickup truck, he smiled the same quiet smile I'd seen the day he restored mine. Every home needs a place where people remember how to stay. I watched him drive away before looking down at the brass mailbox key resting in my hand. Once, it had reminded me of the home I was afraid to lose. Now it reminded me of the home I had finally built. Looking back, the story was never really about $9.50 or $1,900 or the email that arrived at 8:17 a.m. It was about learning that love cannot be measured by what you're willing to sacrifice for people who never stop asking for more. Because in the end, the strongest families aren't the ones that demand loyalty at any cost. They're the ones that never make love collect interest.